right, so let's talk about a really big story going on, which is basically flooding, well, all over the world, but really in China. So the summer floods this year, well, in Germany, they've been bad. They've been bad in a lot of places, and there's all sorts of problems all around the globe with agriculture and with what's going on due to all this floods and all the different changes we're seeing with the climate. But what's going on in China is big news. So China got hit by massive floods just over the last week, so the week of July 20th, 2021. And it's the worst flooding in 50 or 60 years. So this part in northern China, basically the North China Plain, a little western city there called Zhengzhou, which is the capital of a big province and is actually in a particular geographic location that lets it get hit really bad. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, we're just going to talk about floods in general. Then we'll talk a bit about Yellow River floods and this part of China and how this is just basically the last thing any Chinese government wants. And it's historically so associated with problems, it's like ridiculous. This is one of the biggest threats you can actually find to any Chinese government is something related to a problem with the Yellow River and all sorts of out of control water. Talk about the government response, talk about how it sells that response, and then just conclude, talk about what this really means, how to think about it, stuff like that. So let's just get into it really quick. Yeah, so the flooding in China, worst in 50 or 60 years. Everybody talks about the Yangtze. There's Yangtze flooding, and there has been over the last couple of years, but the Yangtze is almost child's play compared to what the Yellow River can do. So what we just saw in Zhengzhou was a year's worth of rain hit this city in 3 days, in 72 hours. A year's worth of rain. It got hit with 8 inches of rain in just 1 hour. So this is water falling from the sky like you wouldn't believe. Like these are the sorts of things that turn into biblical events, really. And over 1 million people instantly displaced. You just see terrible scenes. You see people driving through. They're driving through basically water, but the Yellow River it's called the Yellow River because it's actually brownish, yellowish, burnt orange kind of look. Basically dirt. It looks like dirt because a lot of it is dirt. And it's terrifying. Basically the whole landscape turns brown and it all just liquefies. It's a freaky, freaky thing. And we're seeing pictures of people trapped in subways, people trapped in their cars, just driving through waves and walls of water. And it's a very freaky thing. There's really few things on earth that are as scary as a Yellow River flood. When it really hits, it's like not somewhere you want to be. And yeah, so this one city called Zhengzhou got hit really bad. And we're also seeing other cities get hit nearby as well. So the sky darkens and then just water just pummels the place. And historically, all sorts of dams and infrastructure would break. And that's actually not happening less. Well, that's happening a lot less. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It's a big deal. It's a big deal because, again, it's about the Yellow River. So let's just talk about that. Climate change is almost being used now to help prevent us from ever really learning about the baseline of different regions and different countries. So there does seem to be, the world does seem to be heating up, but every single problem around the world, every sort of major sort of natural disaster is always put and filtered through this lens of climate change. And it's gotten to the point where you can't read an article and actually get how this is different really from the way things are over the long span of time. So China has been dealing with Yellow River floods for over 3,000 years. And these floods in the last couple of days, they're bad, but they're child's play compared to other floods that have happened. So we got to keep that in mind. So don't let everything you hear just be filtered through the climate change narrative. I mean, it is something that's going on, but it's also a narrative that's being pushed because people at all levels of government, throughout the media, throughout the corporate world, want action on these issues, which is a good thing in itself, but doesn't mean every single thing you read about something has to be filtered through that. So that's just a quick preface to talk about how this actually happens. So the two worst natural disasters on Earth, on record, besides pandemics and viruses and stuff like that, and famines, are basically Yellow River floods. Both of them in the 20th century, worst disaster, Yellow River flood. 19th century, worst disaster, Yellow River flood. If you go back in history, it's probably Yellow River floods for like as far back as you can imagine. And the way this works is the North China Plain in northern China. This is where the region that just got hit, Zhengzhou and Henan province, that's like the western part of this giant North China Plain. in northern China. And the Yellow River runs through that. It's the bottom, the lower reaches of the Yellow River Basin. And as the Yellow River is, making its way into the North China Plain, it picks up all this loess material, which is basically a crumbly, dusty sort of dirt, and it gets sucked into the river, and the river turns into this crazy yellow mush that's part dirt, part water, and it's often like over 50% dirt and loess, really, but we'll just call it dirt because it's basically dirt for our purposes. And this loess is, I mean, there's all sorts of bizarre, crazy hydrological, like mathematical things going on with how this stuff spins around in the water, floats around. It does crazy things. There's so much force behind this river. When it really gets going, when this dirt starts spinning and moving inside of it, creates all sorts of problems, creates underwater dams. It does all sorts of insane things. But it also just, at times, it has like multiple pound-feet of water per like square cubic foot. It's wild stuff. It's over 50% dirt at times. And that is the river that feeds northern China. And this is where the whole history of dam building, of water control, hydraulic controls, all this infrastructure, the first infrastructure China really built was stuff to deal with the Yellow River. And it's a major thing. And this city of Zhengzhou is actually at the place where the Yellow River, it's sort of, the river comes out, it flattens and it lowers and it widens after it comes down through all this loess region. And then it starts to fan out in a lot of ways. So it fans out across the North China Plain. And Zhengzhou is the capital of this region because it's at the place where the Yellow River starts to fan out. And that means it's gotten hit by floods historically, probably worse than anywhere else. I mean, that's hard to say because the Yellow River is actually like avulsed and like moved hundreds of miles in a different direction, like crazy stuff. It's a wild river that I'm going to definitely, I have a podcast about that. I haven't actually published or anything, but I'm going to do a lot of stuff about this because this is the core of ancient Chinese history. Is really a lot of it is just dealing with this river. And it is, well, everyone's trying to deal, every Chinese government tries to deal with it. The 1950s early Maoist government was insanely invested in dealing with the Yellow River. It's one of its biggest propaganda pushes was to build tens of thousands of dams all across the country, use concrete, use steel, use all of these new materials to basically show that China could now take command of these ancient problems. And that's kind of true, but there's also just crazy things like this. Well, this wasn't necessarily the Yellow River, but it was a flooding in this sort of region where the reason you see everything dirt is because, again, the water surrounding the water table and the rivers and everything just gets filled up and it starts to burst, and you get, again, that yellow river. Like, because everyone's always wondering, like, why is this stuff brown? Why is the Yellow River, like, why does a flood have brown water just in the streets, in the subways? Well, again, it's related to loess. It's related. This whole region is almost just waiting for one of these things to happen. So yeah, you get mad flooding every summer. You get enormous flooding in China. Most of the rain in northern China comes, all of it, almost like 80% or something, comes during these summer months. So you just see constant threats of summer flooding. It goes back forever. Just last year, there was really bad floods from July to September, and that was bad. But this is trending towards, like, a lot of Chinese outlets will say, oh, this was a once in a thousand year flood and this and that, and that's all kind of true. It's also kind of into some propaganda stuff we're going to talk about in a little bit. But what it is like when this starts happening, it is super scary. And any sort of flooding in the Yellow River there's probably nothing more associated with a Chinese government collapsing and falling than Yellow River floods. That was the end of the Western Han Dynasty, the end of, I think, the Tang Dynasty as well, and a few other, a bunch of minor ones, and it's just associated with these pivotal moments in Chinese history where things start to break, change, they're forced to evolve. Because what happens is when you get these floods in northern China, anywhere along the Yellow River, it leads to this chain reaction of all sorts of problems. So 1 million people were displaced within hours, basically. Within hours, 1 million people were displaced. And back in the day, you'd have tens of millions of people displaced when you didn't have the infrastructure to deal with this sort of thing. So that means huge migration problems just hit this region instantly. And this is a poor region in China. It's basically an agricultural sort of region. It's not an industrial hub. It doesn't have good transportation. It doesn't have good sort of modern economic fundamentals. But it has a lot of people. It has like 90 million people. It's bigger than most countries in Europe. So it's huge. And if you start getting just millions of people just surging in every direction. You start getting stagnant pools of dirty water everywhere. You start getting disease outbreaks. You start getting malaria. You start getting cholera. You start getting all sorts of terrible things. They just spiral. You start getting political violence. You start getting looting. You start getting, it just goes crazy. And historically, they couldn't even fix these. Like, if you typically, flooding like this would cause some levee somewhere to just collapse. It would break, and it would break for like miles. It would break like, just, you'd see, like, you could imagine like Katrina, something like Hurricane Katrina would just hit, and you'd get just terrible flooding for miles. It would look like a lake had formed, and you'd have to send millions and millions of people to try and repair the flood, and then also drain the area. It was a disaster. Often what would happen is you'd have a terrible flood in the summer, and then you'd spend the entire year trying to fix it, and you wouldn't fully get there because you don't have the materials. You didn't have asphalt. You didn't have concrete. You couldn't just pour it out. You couldn't suck it out. You couldn't use all sorts of electrical pumps or anything. You couldn't do any of that. You just had to send millions of laborers to do it, and they would basically get going, and they would just get hit by another flood the next year, and it could often break in the same region for even more, and like spread even farther, or just break in a separate region nearby, and you'd just be overwhelmed, and basically the government would abandon that region, basically sort of, I don't want to say quarantine. Quarantine is a good word. It's kind of a funny word to use now, but they didn't have anywhere near the sort of quarantine. It was more like abandon, like kind of give up on it and sort of let it descend into lawlessness and just kind of try and figure it out a bit later. But it would just overwhelm even the government's ability to pay for this sort of stuff. I mean, the Qing dynasty was paying something like 15% of its entire budget to deal with the Yellow River towards the end in the 19th century. It was just an insane expense. So yeah, and this yearly flooding, like it doesn't sound like this is about the Yellow River, but it really, really is. This is the summer flooding in the North China Plain. If it looks like that, is a Yellow River flood, and it's something to really keep in mind. So the government keeps this in mind. We'll just talk about the next thing now. So just because there are a few things as associated with political collapse as Yellow River flood, the government does not ignore these sorts of things. So if a Chinese government ever ignores a Yellow River flood, or looks like it's not handling it, or just looks completely incompetent, that's basically a sign that China is not long. That government's not long for this world, and Chinese unity is not long for this world, because it's a sign of decadence and corruption, right? The idea, the emperor that can't even respond to the Yellow River flood and the screams of the people, down farther up or upriver in the Yellow River floodplain. It doesn't get worse than that, basically, and you just can't let that happen. So what we actually saw was a major government response in China. So Xi Jinping probably knew about this flood within hours. Like, this is not something like, oh, COVID, we're going to try and not tell the government. No, this was immediate. Like, there was probably all up the chain, because we saw an enormous response. And China's very good at this, but it was just military, police, volunteers, millions. And it was just a total blitz, because you can't let this stuff get out of control. You really can't. The U.S. has very little context for anything like this. So Katrina is kind of the closest analog to what China goes through regularly, which is kind of funny. Like, imagine something like Hurricane Katrina, or even the Great Depression, where you had to build all these crazy monuments, and just having to do this again and again and again and again, and just rebuilding it and it collapses, and rebuilding it and it breaks, rebuilding it and it crumbles eventually. This is the sort of thing that China has gone through for millennia. And so when you talk about cultural psychology, you want to talk about what creates a certain character to a certain people and to a region. That's something we got to really look at, because it's a huge part of China. But if you look at Hurricane Katrina in the early 2000s, that was a major city. I mean, it's basically the mouth of the Mississippi River, New Orleans, very important. But it was so isolated. You don't get the sort of cascades. But we got to remember, like, when all the people that were relocated for Katrina, all of these people, they were relocated to LA, they were relocated to all places across Texas, everywhere. People had to be relocated because things were lost, people were displaced. That is what's going on after every one of these floods in China as well. And so you need control. There's something about the population movement and labor movements in the U.S. We'll go a little off topic for a second. The labor movements in the U.S. are so much more predictable, and they don't need to be controlled in the same way, and they're privately sort of managed, not even managed, they're sort of self-directed in a lot of ways. People are able to move to the west, they're able to move to the south, they're able to move all over. Obviously, there's Homestead Act and there are other things to sort of encourage things in different directions, but people move to Oregon, they moved to Washington, they moved to California, they moved all over, and you didn't need to regulate the flows of people, anything like what you do in China. China's all about regulating the flow of labor and the movement of it. People are always misunderstanding what's up with the hukou system, which is this household registration thing in China. That is an ancient thing that's used to control where people go and what they do, and it's essential for government control. Not to say it's a moral thing or it's a good thing or it doesn't have all these other problems, which is obviously, again, to another topic, but it's not going away ever. So that's the way it is. And this question of these labor movements, these flows, like if you just imagine relocating a million people, or I mean, just in the last couple of years, there's probably been 5 to 7 million people that have had to be relocated in China. And this is the sort of thing that they're doing when nothing has actually spiraled out of control. When you start getting a flood that doesn't get managed, or a war that breaks out, or a famine, or swine flu, or you can have these crises that will just spiral out of control. So that's actually one of the big things that China's always worried about. And then anyone who's read about China, knows China, been to China, should also really be thinking about, because it's what everyone in the government is, even though they're trying to sell that they're trying to take over the world or all that. They're really also worried about making sure the world just doesn't blow up from their perspective in China. So that is it. There's a competent response in China for this sort of stuff. The Chinese government, in comparison to the U.S., which doesn't have to deal with this sort of stuff, like there's fires and there's hurricanes and there's all this stuff in the U.S., but it's not really handled at all in the same way that you see things in China. And China wasn't as good, I'd say honestly, until probably 2005, somewhere around there, the Hu Jintao times, that it wasn't as good. But now it's really built up a lot of systems, and even more importantly, its credibility is on the line in a way the U.S. government isn't. So George Bush could just screw up Katrina, and it was bad, but nothing really. You just move on to the next president. It doesn't really matter. Things don't really work like that in China. There's no one to move on to. The only one that can take the blame is the head guy, or the Communist Party itself. So there's this imposed legitimacy. You have to be good in China. You have to be competent to govern. So you need this competence. You can't, if you don't look competent, you probably won't be leading China very long. So in the modern world, this is actually old, but in the modern world, that means a lot of propaganda, because you can be competent, which you have to be, but you also want people to think you're competent, and you want to make yourself look or appear a lot more competent than maybe you are. So you got to both be competent and you have to look competent, and to look competent means propaganda. It means, yeah, be competent, but also make sure everyone's seeing it exactly the way you want to see it. So propaganda is a constituent part of China, especially ancient China, obviously, but modern China, which only doesn't have political mechanisms, doesn't have transfer of power, doesn't have any of this stuff, running purely on its performance, you're going to need a lot of propaganda to make sure people think you're always doing well. So we're seeing a lot of that with political affairs and economic stuff, environmental stuff. Everywhere, China's on a propaganda blitz. And there's a propaganda department at the head of one of the main agencies associated with the Politburo and the governing structure of China. So that's a major thing. And China sees any natural disaster as a major PR opportunity. So you hear your Xi Jinping, you hear that a major flood is occurring right now. Crazy rain's happening. There's a flood imminent. You send everything you can to go deal with it. And then you start, once you know you've got it under control, you just pump up this entire event. So you see outlets in China talking about how it's a once in 1,000-year flood, it's a once in this, it's a blah, blah, blah. And the only reason it didn't get terrible is because of the Communist Party. And so there's a truth to this and there's a major exaggeration, right? So yeah, I mean, they built all this stuff. So it is totally being, modern China basically is the reason this doesn't get into a terrible disaster. But this just idea that that everything is going to be sort of, any event, any normal yearly flooding is going to be sold as a major win is very weird in another sense. Like it's definitely always being twisted, and the more we got into the 2010s, 2020s, is everything's getting so twisted now that it gets hard to even see where like reality starts and then so the propaganda begins. But it's a major thing, and this makes the government look really good. So it's happy. I won't say it's happy a flood happens, but the Chinese government loves to successfully manage a natural disaster. Uh, almost nothing. I mean, the earthquakes, other floods, these things all over the country, they're actually good. Even handling the pandemic well from the sort of lockdown perspective was a huge boost to the Communist Party. And we need to remember, like, political legitimacy in China is tied in. I mean, everyone in China knows how bad Yellow River floods are. Every Chinese person knows that if flooding in the Yellow River it means bad news. You absorb that through all the years of schooling and history, the arts, everything. It's everywhere. It imbues everything because the government of China is originally a northern Chinese government that basically developed to deal with the Yellow River. It's the old history of it. And political legitimacy in China is tied in with controlling water. So when water gets out of control, roughly speaking, there's like a deep, deep symbolic and practical response that's triggered by basically everybody in the country to see the people start looking, all right, how does the government handle this? The government says, we need to handle this. We need to show that we're handling this. And you have a dialogue, basically. There's a whole conversation going on about water and water management and basically the balance of order and chaos in this country. That is actually what's on the deepest sort of level. That's what's going on whenever there's a major disaster. And yeah, the people want to see the government do a good job. Government wants to do a good job and sell that it's doing a good job. And on this front, it really is, right? So I was given all this stuff about how it's massaged and managed and all that. But in the end of the day, this doesn't turn into one of those chain reactions that can just knock out the entire, system in China. So that's definitely a good thing. And it's an ancient dream of the Chinese people, Chinese government, everything. Before there was a China, this was a ancient dream to control natural disasters like this and to really be able to, put your foot down and prevent the Yellow River from just upending your whole society whenever it chooses to do that. So this is a big moment for the Communist Party. These are the biggest floods in 40 or 50 years. And arguably, this is the major, and we'll see how it goes, but this is one of those major floods that of the reform era of like this since the 1970s, and since China's really had the modern capacity and sort of modern structures it has to deal with this. So Xi Jinping is, like I said, like he learned about this within hours and is going to try and play it pretty well, and he probably will, because it didn't get crazy, and it looks like the rain is moving to other cities. It's not just absolutely like, it's not turning something, it's not just inundating, like turning like the city of Zhengzhou into Atlantis or something. It's actually gonna move on and not become just cataclysmic, right? But it's major, and this is all really important stuff. And I get irritated with the climate change narrative because there's a lot of stuff that is true about the way sort of air patterns and water being kept in the atmosphere, and there's more moisture when it's hotter, and so you can just rain for longer. Like there's all sorts of things that are very true about when things are heating up and all that. But it's actually the real story here is not about, oh, we're having worse floods all over the world because of climate change. It's no, what is going on in this specific region of the world, and what does it mean for where China is? Because we just went over, this is one of the great menaces to China's history. These are terrible things, these Yellow River floods, and it's bad right now, but the government actually managed to handle it. That by itself is new. So arguably it's more new that you have a government handling these floods than it is new that the floods are particularly bad, because there have been floods that make this look not, like I was saying, like not even worth noting in a sense. But the real thing are the changes that have come to China. And so we need that context, and we need this history about what the Yellow River is, why it floods so terribly, how things changed since you got modern industrial technologies, and then where's all this leading, right? So we'll just kind of end on that note. You got to pay attention to these disasters in China. So this chain reaction thing that I was talking about earlier, that is not in this sort of sequence, but there's a chain reaction like that, whether displaced people or a war or a financial crisis or bank runs or ethnic conflicts or some sort of government scandal or weird leaks from different agencies or horrifying revelations about COVID. Some intense chain reaction is the most likely way that China will collapse. It won't be, some war or something might be a part of it, but it won't be that. It will be a chain reaction within the country that starts to destabilize everything. The government loses control, and the and society breaks down. I mean, this has been the story for over 3,000 years, basically. That has been the story. And we need that story, obviously, but we need to know the Yellow River for what it is. And it's not about climate change. It's really about this breakdown that happens when systems fall apart and things get out of control. And the reason people respect the Chinese Communist Party, and the reason it probably has over majority support easily in China, is because no other Chinese government has ever been able to handle disasters like these, ever. And there's a lot of problems with there's a lot of problems with the Chinese Communist Party, but the technical competence that it's gained, but when it reintegrated, when it just happened to be in the 20th and 21st century, so that's a plus, but also integrating with the rest of the world, gaining originally Western science and technology, integrating it, advancing it, applying it to its own country, its own needs, has been totally revolutionary. And this is the thing that is so compelling about China. It's just how it's using technology to transform itself before all of our eyes. While the world around us doesn't change, China builds all these great cities. And from my perspective, the core story in Chinese history is really a battle between geography, broadly speaking, which means nature, basically. Nature, climate, geography, land, water, sea. Nature versus technology. That is the story, the sort of undercurrent of Chinese history since the beginning. And honestly, it didn't have much technology to run with at the beginning. Mostly it just used people and very simple tools, and that doesn't get you very far. But in the modern world, that's really changed. And so almost every challenge that China faces today, the question is, can technology change the historical equation? Can technology make it possible? Can technology remove all the linguistic differences in China? Can technology remove all of the physical distances, the transportation dislocations, and just misconnections that you see all across the country? That places just don't relate and don't actually physically connect to each other. Can it remove all the cultural problems? Can it remove the economic isolation of all these different regions? Can it actually integrate it together into one thing and keep it that way? That's the main question. So, yeah, it's a crazy thing. I mean, people should really think about the Yellow River more than they do. They should think about rivers in general more than any of us do. But China was originally called Yellow River Civilization, and that's actually an accurate term. That's correct. That's where China started. It tells you a lot of things. It tells you where China is. It tells you why China is in a lot of ways. It tells you also a lot about where it's going and kind of where it's come from. So I'll do other videos and we'll definitely get into that and the deep history of how China got this sort of large bureaucratic administrative state that it's had for over 2,000 years now. And we could say what we want about communism or this or that or the nationalism or any of it, but the state structure in China is remarkably consistent. And that is connected with a lot of really interesting things that actually touch on this river and all the stuff we talked about. But we'll leave it at that for now. I think it's actually a good, concise little live stream here. It's definitely profound stuff. I would always pay attention to disasters, watch the quality of the government response, watch how the government markets its response, and watch how the people compare it, how it seems to be, well, is it effective, but also does it seem better than the last one or worse than the last one? So let's say in 2 years, the Chinese Communist Party just can't muster the same sort of capable response that it had to this one. Well, you're always being judged based on your last performance, especially in a system like China. In the US, it feels like everyone's incompetent in the government, so it doesn't even matter. Like, oh, he's incompetent, so is the next guy. So it doesn't matter, but we don't have quite the struggle that they have in China. But if you did really well in the 2021 floods, and then the 2024 floods are twice as bad, and you perform twice as worse, maybe you're in trouble now. Maybe you're in trouble. So that's one of the dangers of this whole performance legitimacy, purely performance legitimacy you see in China. And it's something that always makes everything a challenge. You're never fully out of the woodwork. And China is definitely not ever fully out of the woodwork with this river and these floods because they've been menacing this place for as long as it's existed. And we'll see. China thought it could totally end it, totally overcome it. It's done crazy engineering to the Yellow River over the decades, over the millennia, but it doesn't look like it's fully done the job. So we'll see how it goes and get even deeper on another live stream, another video.